Good morning and welcome as well to our Tree ID webinar for March. My name is Amanda and I'm the Conservation Coordinator at Muskoka Conservancy for those of you who I may not have met before. And today we'll be talking about winter tree ID / early spring, since we technically are into spring now, although it has been feeling a bit more like winter lately. Um, it when most people think about identifying trees, they think about the leaves and, out in spring and summertime, but it is pretty easy to identify by twigs and buds and things like that as well. So I always like to go through winter / spring tree ID at this time of the year to go over some tips and tricks for that. I'll just mention as well that we are recording the webinar just as a heads up to everyone. But I'll go through a little agenda in the next couple slides and we'll get into things. Next slide. So I'll start things off with the land acknowledgement because it's important to us at the Conservancy as well as personally that we acknowledge and express gratitude to the Indigenous peoples who have been living and working on Turtle Island for thousands of years, long before the arrival of European settlers who expropriated and displaced them from their homes and the land. Indigenous peoples cared for the land in a balanced way and continue to be stewards of the land, protectors of the water, and sustainers of life. In Muskoka, we're on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, which includes the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. The Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee nations have also walked on this territory over time. Today, Muskoka is home to three sovereign nations as well, the Wattamohawks First Nations, Moose Deer Point First Nation, and the Moon River Métis. And these lands are covered by the Williams Treaty, the Robinson-Huron Treaty, and the J. Collins Land Purchase. The Rice Lake Treaty 20 also covers a portion of southern Muskoka. We honor all Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit for their cultures, languages, wise teachings, and ways of being that have shaped this country since time began. Now I'll take us through our short little agenda. So I'll start things off with a little bit of an update about Muskoka Conservancy and what we've been up to. And then I'll chat about what tools you need to help you with identifying trees. It's not too many, which is nice. Then we'll look specifically at what you want to look for when identifying trees without leaves. And we'll look at our conifers first, and then we'll look at our deciduous trees. And how to specifically identify 22 common species found in Muskoka. I also have this handy little key to tree ID and corresponding guide chart that I'll go over towards the end of the presentation as well, which everyone will get a copy of later this afternoon when we send out a little email with all of that good stuff and follow-up. So a little bit about Muskoka Conservancy. So we are the Land Trust or Nature Conservancy of Muskoka, and we are a registered charity as well. And we've been around since 1987, so for about 38 years this year. And our mission is to conserve and protect the nature of Muskoka. And we do this by physically acquiring land, either through donation from generous community members. Sometimes communities will raise funds for us to purchase lands as well. And in more recent years, there's been more federal and provincial grants, as well as family foundations interested in funding land conservation and nature conservation. So through these different means, once land is acquired by the Conservancy, it's then protected in perpetuity for all of our future generations of humans, as well as all of the plant and animal life as well. So currently we are protecting 58 different areas across the Muskoka region, and this adds up to 5,122 acres of land in total. Just over 65,000 feet of sensitive shoreline and riparian areas on our large lakes, like if you think of Lake Muskoka and Lake Joseph, as well as some of our smaller but equally as important lakes as well. And we are very close to protecting 900 acres of wetlands, like this beautiful wetland here at our Bill Dickinson Nature Reserve in southern Gravenhurst. Wetlands are one of my favorite biodiverse ecosystems to hang out around. So very exciting that we're protecting lots of these important areas. Um, I like to mention as well that most of these areas are closed to the public and protected strictly for nature conservation, but we do have a handful that are open to the public with some small trail systems and a few more that are slated to have trails developed in upcoming years. So there are some opportunities to get people out on the land. And we'll also do nature quests, which are guided hikes on different protected areas that might not necessarily be open to the public as well. And the last thing I'll mention about the Conservancy before we get into our trees is that we are a member-based organization. We do have a relatively small staff here. So I always like to give a shout out to our members who support and fund a lot of the work that we do, as well as our volunteers who are out there with us supporting and leading different events and activities in the community. So thank you to everyone for joining us today, and to all of our members and volunteers and folks that are interested in learning more. Um, so with all of that about the Conservancy, we'll get into how to identify our trees and what we need, what tools we can use to help us. So the first thing that's the most important is having binoculars. This can be very, very helpful, especially when we are looking at mature trees, where when you're looking at them, everything that's at eye level is the bark. And bark isn't necessarily the best thing to go off of. You can't only use bark to identify a tree. So you want to make sure you got your binoculars so you can look up into the canopy and get a closer view of the twigs and the buds to more carefully and accurately identify a tree. So binoculars are very, very handy for getting up close to things that are very far away from you and to be able to see those. Oftentimes people, they might look at the bark and maybe take a glance up and then say, oh, but look on the ground, there's a bunch of oak leaves. So this has to be an oak, but leaves can blow in from anywhere. So it's not a great idea to just go off of the leaves that are on the ground. So making sure you have binoculars to help you out is very, very handy. Now, sort of the opposite of binoculars is it can be really handy to have a hand lens or a magnifying glass. So when you are looking at a smaller, younger tree and you've got leaves or you've got branches and buds right in front of you, and you want to see some of those really small details on the buds and the branches, you can use a hand lens or magnifying glass to look in at some of those key features, whether it's hairs or serrations on a leaf or things like that. Really helps you zoom in on those little tiny details. And then the last thing that's really helpful is to have a tree ID field guide or a key, which we'll talk about a little later on, the one that we'll hand out to everyone. But a really great guide book that you can get is Trees in Canada, which covers all of the possible trees that you could be seeing in Canada. This is what, when I was in school studying trees, this is what we used in school. So it's a very handy book if you're interested in getting a book field guide as well. So not too many things that you need, but really handy to have just to help you out. And we'll get into our coniferous trees next. So what are we going to be looking for our coniferous trees? We'll start off with the leaves because these will be present for the most part in the winter time. And there's three different things you'll want to consider when looking at the leaves of a coniferous tree. So the first thing you'll look at is the type of leaf that you're looking at. So whether it's a needle, which is what most of our conifers have, like our pines and our firs, for example, here. We also have one species that has a scale type leaf, and that is our cedar tree. So they have little scale-like plates on the leaves, similar to like the scales on a snake or something like that. And then the last option is absent. So we have one species that does not have any leaves in the winter time, which we will talk about as we get into the specifics as well. The next thing is considering the shape. So whether they are flat, like they've been compressed between two heavy books, like the balsam fir example here, whether they're cone shape or sort of circular all around, like our pine needles, or whether they're square, so they have a bit of shape to them, and they have some ridges on the needles. Um, there's one species that we'll look at that is like that. And then the last thing you'll want to consider for the leaves is the arrangement. So whether the needles are bundled and coming from one point, like our pine trees, or if they're single, so coming off individually from the branches. You'll also want to consider the bark because it can be very helpful when looking at mature trees. For bark, you're going to be considering the texture as well as the color. So the texture can either be smooth, like this middle one here, relatively flat bark. It does have some raised resin blisters on here, but overall it's generally smooth. Furrowed, like this one on the left, which has these ridges and deep furrows, very rough appearance to it, or scaly, like this one on the right, which again has that rough appearance, but you can sort of see that there's these little plates and flakes of bark that look like scales, almost like you can flake them off. So those are the three different kinds of texture. And color is generally always going to be some variety of brown or gray, but there's often different hues and undertones that you'll notice in the bark as well. So that's what we'll be looking for. So those are the features we're going to be considering as we go through our specific conifer trees, and we'll get into that now. So the first one we're looking at is our eastern white pine. I have included the scientific names as well, just because they're fun for me to say in practice. So our eastern white pine is Pinus strobus. When we're looking at the leaves of our eastern white pine, like all pines, they're needles and they're cone-shaped. For our white pine, they're a light bluish, yellowish green. They're sort of like lime colored, and if you look up into the canopy, you can see that they're sort of like a lighter, brighter green compared to our other pines. The length is considered medium to long, 5 to 15 centimeters in length. And they're also very flexible. So if you get your hands on some white pine leaves and you sort of wiggle them around, they are flexible and they won't break or snap or anything like that. When looking at the arrangement, again, all of our pines are bundled, but our eastern white pine will always have around 5 leaves in a bundle. So the key thing to remember this is that white has 5 letters in the word, and there's 5 leaves in a bundle. When looking at the mature bark of the tree, it's relatively gray in appearance, and it's got these very rough, thick ridges, which are separated by some deep furrows. And the older and larger the tree, the more rough in appearance the bark will be. Our next pine that we'll look at is our red pine. So again, cone-shaped needles. In terms of their color, they're going to be a darker green. So again, when you look up into the canopy, you can sort of see overall that they're darker in appearance than our white pines. They're also very long, longer than the white pine, 10 to 16 centimeters in length. And if you were to get your hands on some of these needles and to twist them around, they would break. So they are brittle and they're thick and they will snap if you bend them. In terms of the arrangement, bundled, but only 2 leaves in a bundle. So although red has 3 letters in the word, it is a shorter word than white. So 2 leaves in a bundle for our red pine and 5 for our white pine. When looking at the bark of our red pine, it's considered to be scaly. So it's got these little sheets that look like they can flake off. Brown in color, but it's got this sort of reddish pink undertone to it that you'll notice, which can be a really helpful key ID feature for our red pine or Pinus resinosa. The last pine that we'll look at is our Scots pine, which is Pinus sylvestris. It is actually an invasive species, but it's pretty common around the Muskoka area. Cone-shaped needles, they're a bit duller in color, as you can see in the bundle here. but still green, of course, but more of a grayish green. And they're really short as well compared to our red pine, so only 4 to 8 centimeters long. And they're often pretty stiff, and they've got this sort of twisted appearance to them, which you can also see in this twig here. They have 2 leaves in a bundle as well, similar to the red pine, but the length and the twistedness to them is a giveaway for it being a Scots pine, so much shorter leaves. The bark is also a really good key ID feature for our Scots pine. It is grayish to reddish brown at the bottom. But if you look up towards the canopy, as you get higher and higher on the trunk, the bark will turn more orange in color and it'll get more papery and flaky. So it'll be flaking off. Sometimes you'll see flakes on the ground around you. But really key is look up. If it's orange and flaking, it's going to be a Scots pine for sure. Next is our eastern white cedar, or Thuya occidentalis. This is our one conifer species that has those scaled leaves, which are a yellowish green lime color. The arrangement is single. As you can see, they come off singly, and then they will start branching off as well, so not clustered. And the bark is pretty unique for our cedars as well. It's this brownish gray color. Often it's got a bit of a pinkish orange hue to it as well, but it's got these long, narrow strips that no other conifer tree will have. So lots of key features to easily identify the eastern white cedar. Now we're moving into our flat single arrangement conifers. So this one is our eastern hemlock, or Tsuga canadensis. As you can see, the needles are coming off single from the branch. They're relatively short. They're the shortest needles you'll see on a conifer tree in Muskoka, only 1 to 2 centimeters in length. Very, very shiny, waxy green on top, and it is lighter underneath. It doesn't have that shiny color to it. And let's see if I can zoom us in a bit. They are attached by a stalk. So if you look at the leaves and where they attach to the branch, there's this little stalk or little piece that connects them to the branch, which is a key feature for eastern hemlock. The bark is a dark brownish gray, but if you were to flick off the first couple layers of bark, underneath you'd find this Merlot, like reddish purple color underneath. So I don't recommend going out and ripping bark off of trees, but if you are, practicing your ID and you think you're looking at a hemlock, you can flick off a little piece, or look for a spot that's already been flicked off by a bird or something. And if you see that reddish color underneath, that's a key feature for the eastern hemlock. But otherwise, rough, deep furrowed bark. One other thing I'll mention for the eastern hemlock, though, is that this is a tree that's often used by sapsuckers, which leave really small pinholes and lots of pinholes on the bark. So if you find a tree that looks like eastern hemlock and it's got all of these sapsucker holes in it, chances are it's going to be a hemlock for sure. Our next similar species to the eastern hemlock is the balsam fir, or Abies balsamea. So it's similar in the fact that it's got flat needles that come off singly from the branch. They don't have quite as shiny an appearance as the hemlock, but they are still a dark green color. Their length is a little bit longer. It is noticeably longer once you start practicing and picking up on these things. So generally 1.5 to 2.5 centimeters in length. And again, let's see if we can zoom in. Because these leaves don't have a stalk that attaches them to the branch, but you can see that the leaf grows directly off of the branch. So that's called sessile, or a stalkless leaf. The leaves also have a very, very strong smell. So this tree gives off the Christmas tree smell. So if you were to rub a branch between your hands, you would definitely get that aroma from the balsam fir. The bark is quite unique and different as well. It's grayish brown and relatively smooth all over, and it just has these raised resin blisters that will fill up with sap in the spring and summertime. So that's our balsam fir. Next, we've got our white spruce or Picea glauca. Similar in appearance to the last two we looked at. So it's got single needles coming off the branch. Might look relatively flat to begin with, but this is our one species that does have those square needles. So they've got sort of edges to the needles. So if you were to pull one off and roll it between your fingers, it would roll around compared to if you pulled off a flat needle and it would just sort of shift around, it wouldn't roll. In terms of color, dark green, it will sometimes, new growth will have a bluish tinge to it as well. And the needles are relatively short. In terms of the arrangement, we already talked about how it comes off singly from the branch. But if you were to look at a branch like this, hopefully you guys can see me because I can't see myself right now. But all of the needles would come off the sides, but they'd also come off the top as well. Whereas if you look at a hemlock or a fir, they're all coming off flat from the branch, but these ones will be clustered on top of the branch as well. In terms of the bark, brown with a pinkish hue to it at times, and it is considered scaly, as you can see these little scaly flakes that could come off the bark. White spruce. And our last one that we'll talk about is our tamarack or Larix lariacina, which is our one coniferous species that will have no leaves in the wintertime. If you were to see one in the summertime, though, it does have flat needles that are bluish green in color. They're really short, but they do come off in bundles or tufts. So whereas with our pines, there's always a certain number of leaves coming out of a bundle, with our tamarack, it could be anywhere between 15 and 60 needles coming out of one tuft. But in the wintertime, all you'll see left behind are the old buds from where the leaves were growing out of, and the bark as well, which is reddish brown to gray in color, with this more chocolatey brown underneath. And it is considered to be scaly in texture as well. So that is all of our conifers, and we'll dive right into our deciduous trees. So what are we going to look for? We'll start things off with arrangement. There's two options for our deciduous trees. Buds and leaves will either be opposite, so they're directly opposite each other on the branch, as you can see here and up here, or they're alternating off of the branch, like in this example on the right. First thing you're going to look for, there's two species groups that are opposite arrangement, our ashes and our maples, and all the rest are alternate. So it's the first thing you're going to look for is arrangement. When looking at the twigs and buds, for our twigs, you'll consider the color of the twigs, if there's any markings or bumps or different colors on the twigs popping up. You'll also consider the smell for some of them and the size, so whether they're thin and slender or thick and stout. For our buds, you'll look at the shape, the color, the size, and the length. And we've got this example here that has a little bit of a diagram that I'll take you through. So these are some of the things that we'll look at as we go through the different species. So the terminal bud is the bud that is at the end or the terminal end of the branch or twig. Bud scales are scales that grow on top of the buds and are sort of like a protective coating before they sprout out into leaves. The lateral buds are the ones that are found on the sides of the twig. And lenticels are these little marks that will appear on some of our trees' twigs, and they're pores that are used for gas exchange. But some of them will have these and they'll be very obvious, and others do not. So those are the main sort of features we'll look at for our twigs. In terms of bark, same thing as our conifer trees. We're going to look for the texture, whether it's smooth, rough and furrowed, or rough and scaly. And we'll look at color and different hues as well. And we'll jump right into our specific species. So starting off with our opposite arrangement species, we've got our maples. And this is our sugar maple, or Acer saccharum. As you can see, the buds are opposite to each other on the branch. When looking at the terminal bud of the sugar maple, it is very pointed in its shape, and the lateral buds are pointed as well, but not as much as the terminal bud. Buds are a medium dark brown color, and it's very similar in color to new growth on the twig as well. So it's shiny, reddish, dark brown, almost like a caramel or maple syrup color, if you will. And the twigs are also considered to be thin and slender. When looking at the bark, for our young maples, which we don't have a picture of here, it'll be smooth and gray. With our older, mature individuals, they will be gray with long vertical ridges. But all of our maples, in my opinion, the bark tends to look very similar. So I definitely don't use that as a key ID feature to look for, but I'll be looking up into the canopy at the branches and the buds. So that's our sugar maple. Next is our red maple or silver maple. So, excuse me, in the wintertime, our red maples and silver maples actually look identical, and you can't tell the difference between the two. So our red maple is Acer rubrum, and our silver maple is Acer saccharinum. Again, they've got that opposite arrangement, but when you're looking at the buds of our red and silver maple, they are much more rounded than the sugar maple. And when looking at the terminal bud, they are twice as long as they are wide. So they're very, very long in comparison to their width. New growth and buds will be shiny and very red in color. Buds, if you look up into the canopy, will be quite swollen and large in appearance. So you'll really be able to pick out the buds if you look into the canopy in springtime. In terms of the size of the twigs, they're considered to be very thin and slender as well. Similar to our sugar maple, bark when young is smooth and gray, but when it gets older, it turns more grayish brown with more scaly ridges. So they do tend to peel a bit more in our red and silver maple, but again, not a feature you can rely on completely for identifying our maples. Our second family of opposite arrangement trees is our ash family. And we're looking at white ash first, which is Fraxinus americana. When looking at the buds of our white ash and looking specifically at the terminal bud, you'll notice that it's wider than it is long, which is a key feature for this one. And that the two uppermost lateral buds will touch the terminal bud. So there's no space between the terminal bud and the first lateral buds. In terms of color, they're sort of like a reddish chocolatey brown color. When comparing our maples and our ashes, one of the key things to look for is the thickness of the twig. So with our maples, we touched on how they're very thin and slender, but our ashes will be thick and stout. And you'll be able to notice that difference when you're looking at them in the field. For the color of the twigs, they tend to be shiny for new growth and purple to gray in color. a lot of our ashes aren't doing too great. Many of you probably are aware of the emerald ash borer, which is an invasive insect that attacks and damages our ash trees. So they may not always be in the best condition when you are looking at them out in the field. When looking at the bark of our white ash, this is a key ID feature for our white ash. So it's a light gray color, but it's got these deep furrows that create this uniform, narrow diamond pattern across the bark. So hopefully you can sort of see that diamond pattern in here. That is key for our white ash. Next is our black ash, or Fraxinus nigra. When looking at the buds of this guy, the terminal bud is broad and pointed, and those two uppermost lateral buds will not touch the terminal bud. So there will be a space between them. So that's one of the key differences when looking at the twigs and buds of a black ash versus a white ash, is that space between the buds. And they are a dark brown color. The twigs, again, are thick and stout. Green with purple lenticels are sometimes you're able to make those out. And as they get older, older growth will be more of a dull gray, like this individual here. The bark is pretty key for our black ash as well. It's a light grayish brown color, but it's actually very soft. And it's got these sort of corky ridges to it. So if you were to press your fingernail into the bark of a black ash, it would actually leave an indent behind. That's how soft it is, compared to the white ash, which is very hard with those deep furrows. When I was in school and I was learning all about trees, they referred to black ash bark as like oatmeal slapped onto a tree, and that has really stuck with me. So if that resonates with you when looking at black ash bark, that's something you can use to remember, is that oatmeal-like appearance. I've also made a little other note here for our black ash, which considers the habitat. So black ash is very specialized in where it likes to grow, and it likes to have its feet wet. So it's often in lowland areas and growing in swamps. So considering things like habitat and where trees are found can help with some of our different species, like black ash. We will move on to our alternate arrangement species now, and we'll start things off with our birches. So when looking at the buds of the white birch, or Betula papyrifera, they are slender and narrow, and they tend to be greenish at the base and brown at the tip. This isn't the best photo for seeing that, though, unfortunately. The twigs are considered thin and slender, and they have sparse white resin glands, which you can sort of see. Let's see if I can zoom in here. You can see some of those little white dots, hopefully, on the twig here, which gives it a bit of a like pretzel appearance, like salt on a pretzel. Of course, when we're looking at a mature white birch tree, they're very, very easy to identify by their bark. So they've got these thick white sheets of peeling bark. Nothing else is going to look like this in nature. But when you are looking at a younger white birch tree, they don't have this white appearance. So they're very dark reddish brown, and they're pretty shiny in color as well. And they will have lenticels, which you can see in the adult bark as well. So there will be these sort of pores present on the bark. So that's our white birch. Our other birch is our yellow birch, or Betula alleganiensis, which is a very fun one to say. The buds, again, are slender. They've got a sharp point. And when they're young and new growth, they can be hairy, which is one of those times where it might be handy to pull out your hand lens and see if you can see some of those fine hairs growing. Twigs are thin and slender, as you can see. And again, new growth for the twigs will have some of that fine hair present as well. uniform brown in color. But an interesting thing with our yellow birch is that if you were to crush a branch or tear a little piece off, it actually smells really strongly of wintergreen, and apparently tastes like it as well, which I have not tasted, but I have smelt it before. So again, I don't recommend, tearing up all the branches that you find, hoping that there'll be a yellow birch. But, if you want to try it once or twice, just to see if it does have that wintergreen smell, you can try that out to help you identify a younger yellow birch tree. When looking at the bark of the yellow birch, it's got these papery pieces as well, but instead of being thicker sheets like the white birch, they're more like thin and curling shreds that come off of the bark. Are of course more yellow or golden in appearance. So you can tell the difference between yellow and white birch bark that way. And then I'll just mention as well that when they're young, they look pretty similar to young white birch as well. The bark is relatively thin, it's shiny, reddish brown, and it'll have those lenticels as well. Our next species here is black cherry or Prunus serotina. When looking at the buds of this guy, they're cone-shaped, sort of like an ice cream cone, and very sharp pointed. The bud scales will be green at the base, which you can see in this one lower on the branch, and then get browner towards the tip. When looking at the twigs, new growth is reddish brown, and old growth is more gray, like the example we have here. And this is another species that you can identify by smell, although I've not actually done this before. But if you were to crush a branch of black cherry, it supposedly smells like almonds. So maybe you can try that out the next time you're out in the field as well. The bark can be very key for identifying mature black cherries as well. So as you can see in this picture here, it's quite scaly with those pieces and flakes. And it's very dark brown in color, which gives off a burnt cornflakes appearance to it. When it's young, it's smooth and shiny, grayish brown in color, and it will have those raised lenticel pores as well present. Next is our trembling aspen or Populus tremuloides. So our aspens and poplars are the same family. When looking at the buds of our trembling aspen, they're quite conical in shape as well and pointed. This is sort of a gnarly example here. This was from an older tree, but in less gnarly examples, you will notice more so how the buds will curl towards the twigs and the branches. And they've also got this really waxy red color in appearance as well. When looking at the twigs, they're considered to be thin and slender. New growth will be shiny, dark green, brownish gray. It's all a bit variable, and it'll get more of a lighter gray, as you can see in the older growth at the bottom here. The bark is quite unique for our poplar trees. So specifically for the trembling aspen, if you look at the base of the tree, it'll be rough in appearance with furrows and ridges. But if you look up towards the canopy, you'll actually notice that it starts to smooth out. And with our trembling aspen, it turns from this rough gray appearance to this smooth white color, almost similar to our white birch. So that transition in appearance is a key thing for our trembling aspen from that dark gray color to a lighter white color up top. The next poplar we'll look at is our large tooth aspen or Populus grandidentata. When looking at the buds of this guy, the terminal bud is quite oval in shape, and it will have fine white hair, which you can sort of see. We'll zoom into this guy. you can sort of make out how it's sort of got that grayish white appearance. So that's actually fine hair that grows on the new growth and new buds. The lateral buds will be noticeably more slender and smaller than the terminal bud. The twig is thin and slender. It's a dull brownish gray, and it's got that fine hair for new growth as well. When considering the bark of our large tooth aspen, similar to the trembling aspen, it's got that darker gray, furrowed, rough appearance at the base. As you look up into the canopy, it will smooth out as well. But opposed to the trembling aspen, which is very light and white in color, when you look up into the canopy of a large tooth aspen, it will be lighter, but it will have a greenish, yellow, or orange hue at the top. So it's almost colored at the top, and it won't be light like our trembling aspen. Our next species here is our white elm, or Ulmus americana. The buds on the white elm are very narrow and oval in shape. And as you can see, they're pressed up right against the twig. When looking at the terminal bud, it is what is referred to as canted, which means it comes out at a 45-degree angle. And elms are the only species that will have this canted terminal bud. Reddish brown in color, and sometimes they'll have some hair on them as well. The twigs are very, very slender and thin compared to some of our other species, and grayish brown in color. And the bark, pretty standard tree bark for our white elm, dark grayish brown with these deep sort of fine furrows. Next, we have our American beech, or Fagus grandifolia. Pretty much everything about the American beech is unique. It's very, very easy to identify for that reason. So when we're looking at the buds, they're slender and pointed and very long, as you can see, compared to a lot of the other trees we've looked at. So they can be 1.5 to 2.5 centimeters long. And the lateral buds will point out from the twig, which tends to give them a bit of a zigzag appearance, as you can see here. The twigs and buds are both an orangey brown color, which is quite unique and stands out. And the twigs are considered to be thin as well, of course. When looking at the bark of our American beech, it is pretty much the only one that is smooth as a mature tree. It's got this bluish gray color to it, often compared to like elephant skin. But unfortunately, a number of our beech trees are affected by beech bark disease, so they don't always have this nice smooth appearance if they're affected by this invasive species. And they will have cankers or fungi growing on the bark occasionally. One other note for our American beech is that they'll hold on to their leaves in the wintertime. Again, really helpful for identifying them in the winter if you see their nice golden orange leaves hanging on in the wintertime. Next, we've got ironwood, or Ostrea virginiana. The buds on our ironwood are very oval in shape, and they are pointed as well. Similar to the beech that we just looked at, you can sort of tell that these buds point out from the bark, or from the twig, which gives them, again, a zigzag appearance if you're looking at the branches. And the buds are greenish brown, and they occasionally will have hair on them as well. When looking at the twigs of our ironwood, they are extremely thin and slender. In fact, the buds are wider than the twig is, which is a key thing to look for ironwood. Very, very large buds compared to the thickness of the twig, and reddish brown in color. The bark is pretty unique for ironwood as well. It's grayish brown in color, but it's almost similar to our eastern white cedar in that it's got these narrow, thin vertical strips in the bark that no other deciduous tree will really have. So that's our ironwood. And now we are on to our last species group, our oaks, starting off with red oak or Quercus rubra. When looking at the buds, they are oval and wide and very pointed for our red oak. And when looking at the terminal bud, you'll notice that there's actually several. So they have clustered terminal buds, and our oaks are the only species that you'll see with multiple buds coming out of the terminal of the twig, shiny reddish brown in color. The twigs of our oaks are considered to be thick and stout compared to our more slendered twig species, and they're reddish brown in color as well. The bark for a red oak is relatively smooth, but it's got these grooves in it. So these very fine furrows that will pop up. And the bark in these furrows tends to be a reddish pink color. So again, a tip that I learned when I was in school was that it almost looks like the splits in a hot dog. If you're roasting hot dogs and they split open, that's what red oak bark looks like. The other thing for our oaks is that they often will hold their leaves in the wintertime as well. So that's another thing you can look for. Now, our last species is our white oak or Quercus alba. So again, they've got those clustered terminal buds like the red oak, but you'll see that they are quite rounded and blunt tipped, so not pointy like our red oak. Reddish brown color. The twigs again are thick and stout, reddish, green, brown to gray. So really they can be any color. But the key things to look for is that clustered terminal bud and the fact that they're rounded. The bark for a white oak is very, very gray in color, and it is considered to be more scaly as well. It doesn't have those thick, deep furrows, but it's got more of these scale-like plates to it. So that is all of our trees that we'll cover today. I've got a little bonus slide on spring ephemerals because I'm sure you guys are like me and you're very excited for spring to get here, hopefully very soon. So I just wanted to touch on some spring ephemerals, then we'll go into the guide and key that I'll share with you guys, and then any questions that you have. So spring ephemerals are on their way. Hopefully within the next month or so, we'll see these popping up. So we'll just go through some of them as a little reminder of what to look forward to soon. The first one up here is our trout lily, which gets its name for its leaves, which are speckled like a trout skin. And it's got these really beautiful yellow bell flowers that come off of it. Down here on the left, we've got our painted trillium, which is very similar to, the more common large white trillium, but it's got this really nice color in the center of the flower, which almost looks like it's been painted on, which is how it gets its name. Our pink lady slipper is a member of the orchid family, which is pretty common around Muskoka. It does bloom later in May time, but it's got this really beautiful slipper-like pink flower to it. Our short-lobed hepatica here has this nice little pinkish white flower. And its leaves, which you can see here, actually will start off green, but as it gets older, they turn this rich red color, which is pretty cool. You can see some trout lilies in the back as well. And then the last one we'll talk about is our bunchberry, which actually belongs to the dogwood family. If anyone's familiar with like red osier dogwood, which is a pretty common shrub, you'll notice that the leaves of the bunchberry have a very similar appearance to our dogwoods, except of course this isn't a shrub. It's a flower member of that family. So that's our spring ephemerals. I'll go through our key and guide chart very quickly. And then if we've got any questions, we'll get to those. So this here in the center of the screen is our key to tree ID, which is where you will start if you're looking at trying to identify a tree. It works just like any flow chart. You start at the top, and then there's a series of questions that will guide you down to a specific sort of species group of trees, and those are all color coordinated as well. So once you get down through and you answer through your questions and you get to, for example, spruce, you can look over to our guide to winter tree identification, which has some more details for our specific species. So let's say we got to spruce, which is a dark blue color. Here's dark blue, our spruce family for our coniferous trees. And we've got some more details for the leaves, for the bark, and then any other additional notes or tips and tricks to help you with identifying them, which you can use to then identify to species. For our deciduous trees, it looks a little bit different. So we've got the twig, buds, bark, and other notes for the details that are included in there. And again, you can read through, look at the specific details to help narrow down what species you're looking at. So we'll send that out to everyone later today so you can print it off or have it on your cell phone or tablet and head out into nature and practice your tree ID. So yeah, I'll close my screen here and we'll see if we've got some questions in here. So Francesca asked, do the hairs found on twigs and buds serve a particular purpose? That I do not know. I would definitely have to look into that. I have no idea what the purpose might be. So good question, Francesca. I do have the phone number here and my email address as well. So feel free to jot that down or take a photo of it if you ever have questions, about tree ID or anything else you see in nature. You can give me a shout or send me an email, and I'm always happy to connect with you guys. So Philip asked if we can send out the PowerPoint. Absolutely. I'll do that with those resources as well. You're welcome, everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us today to learn some more about Tree ID. I hope you guys learned some cool stuff, and hopefully we'll see you at our next webinar as well. Thanks, everyone. Okay, I'll end the meeting now. And like I said, if you ever have questions, just let me know. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.